I love a good witch story. If I'm being honest, if it's a kid-friendly witch story, that's even better. And one of my favorite parts of the Halloween season is mixing some kid-friendly movies in with the actual horror movies. And the first one up this year is 1990's The Witches. And I think we all know the reason this movie has ended up standing the test of time, and that's the work done by Jim Henson and his team, specifically the makeup for the Grand High Witch, a design that I think is still genuinely terrifying in 2025. But there's also a lot more to love about this movie, which is why today we're diving into The Witches, how it came to be, why it's awesome, and its legacy 35 years later. Welcome back to Born to Rant. I'm Brandon. Now, let's talk about Bitches! My history with this movie stretches back to the mid-90s, and I honestly cannot remember if I read the book or saw the movie first. But what I do know is this: I definitely only read the book once, but I've seen this movie probably a dozen times over the years. It feels like this movie was just always on HBO throughout the 90s and 2000s. Not that my parents ever paid for HBO, but my grandpa did. So whenever I would stay at his house as a kid, I would inevitably end up staying up all night watching movies. Like this weird Alicia Silverstone, Peter O'Toole movie called Rock My World, but also The Witches was one of the ones that I remember watching at least half a dozen times in the bedroom at my grandpa's. And I remember being genuinely terrified of the Grand High Witch and also watching on a small tube TV and thinking, wait, did I just see a bald man in the crowd? Wait, was that another one? Every single time I watched this movie, but I wasn't able to pause or even rewind to double check. Spoiler alert though, the answer is yes, there are lots of bald men in the crowd during the convention scene. And The Witches wasn't ever a movie I owned, but like I said, I've seen it a lot over the years. And before we go any further, if you're enjoying this video so far, just a reminder to like and subscribe. And if it means anything to you, I use no AI in the making of my videos. Now, let's go back in time and learn a bit about how The Witches came to be. Obviously, this movie is an adaptation of the Roald Dahl book of the same name. And if you don't know who Roald Dahl is, he wrote some books you might have heard of, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, and The Fantastic Mr. Fox, all of which also all have movie adaptations that rock. And the novel The Witches was released in 1983, and the rights were quickly snatched up for it to be adapted into a movie, and it would be a joint production between the Jim Henson Company and Lorimar Film Entertainment. And sadly enough, this would end up being the final movie that the Jim Henson Company produced during Jim Henson's lifetime. It would also be the final movie produced by Lorimar Film Entertainment, actor May Zetterling's final English language film before her death, and the final Roald Dahl adaptation produced during his lifetime. And in developing the movie, Jim Henson decided they needed a director with some style, someone who knew how to be frightening on a subconscious level. And Nicholas Roeg was just the man for the job, having developed his disjointed style on movies like Don't Look Now and The Man Who Fell to Earth. Roeg really feels like such an interesting choice given his past works, but I do think he absolutely nailed directing this movie. As far as casting is concerned, the main thing to note is that there were about a dozen other actresses considered for the role of the Grand High Witch, including Cher, Liza Minnelli, Sigourney Weaver, and many more. But of course, the role ended up going to the one and only Anjelica Huston, and I really can't imagine anyone else playing this role. Get out of here, Anne Hathaway. So on April 11th, 1988, The Witches went into production with an $11 million budget, and filming took place entirely in England, with a lot of the production taking place at the Headland Hotel. Actually, while the movie was filming there, Anjelica Huston and Jack Nicholson were dating, and he spent quite a bit of time there, and he would also frequently send Huston large bouquets of flowers, something that the employees of the hotel apparently really loved. But that isn't even the craziest Headland Hotel story, because after taking a bath and falling asleep one night, Rowan Atkinson forgot to turn the water off completely and ended up flooding his room and ruining a bunch of film equipment that was being stored in the room directly beneath his, straight up out of a Mr. Bean sketch. And filming lasted right around 4 months, ending in August of '88. Unfortunately, that's when the movie's problems would really start, because as I mentioned earlier, this was the final movie produced by Lorimar Film Entertainment, and that was because they went bankrupt while finishing the movie, which meant that The Witches was left without a distributor. That is until Warner Brothers stepped in and bought the distribution rights, though it sounds like they were never super confident in the movie because they shelved it for an entire year before even trying to do some test screenings in February of 1990. And finally, thanks to the strength of those test screenings, the movie movie was released in the UK on May 25th, 1990, and the US on August 24th, 1990. And on its opening weekend in the States, it made just $2.2 million against its $11 million budget and placed 10th at the box office, well below movies like Darkman, which actually I just covered recently. Go check it out if you haven't. And even though The Witches was popular with critics and had a good word of mouth, it just never found its lane at the box office, making a worldwide total of just $15.3 million. And with all of that out of the way, I think it's time that we dive deep into The Witches and everything that makes it awesome. And here is your one and only spoiler warning for a movie that's old enough to run for president of the United States.
You are in for a treat.
The movie begins with this really excellent title sequence that feels like it could be a nod to The Shining. Actually, there are a few moments in this movie that remind me of The Shining. Like, there were a few times they show the hotel with the same kind of horn sound used in The Shining. But there's also lots of crash zooms like Kubrick used in The Shining. So the opening of the movie also introduces us to the excellent score of Stanley Myers, a composer whose work I have to admit I'm pretty unfamiliar with. And the saddest part about The Witches having an excellent score is that it's actually a damn near impossible soundtrack to track down, because it was never officially released by Warner Brothers, which is dumb because listen to how hard this soundtrack goes. Now, the movie actually begins with a long montage of May Zetterling as the grandma of our main character Luke, who's played by Jason Fisher, and she's explaining her history with witches and how to spot a witch. And the story that grandma tells from her childhood about her best friend being abducted by a witch is genuinely pretty scary and makes for a great stranger danger allegory. The whole book was originally written as an allegory for stranger danger and trying to keep kids safe, but I digress. So we learned that as a little girl, grandma's friend was abducted by a witch and that she may or may not have mysteriously appeared in a painting only to one day disappear. Like I said, genuinely scary. The opening really does a great job of setting up the world of the movie. We learn that the witches wear wigs and gloves, have a purple tint to their eyes, and despise children, both in general and the smell of them, with grandma comparing the smell to
dog's droppings.
Now, this fun little montage of grandma getting Luke ready for bed and telling him about witches and how to spot them is sadly undercut when we find out the next morning that Luke's parents have been killed in a car accident. You know, typical Roald Dahl stuff. So now it's just Luke and grandma, and she decides not to take him back to America and instead have him stay with her in England. And all seems to be going well until one day when Luke is climbing a tree and a strange woman stops by. And just shout out to my boy Luke, who recognizes this lady as a witch almost immediately. And when the witch says,
"She can't hear you,"
it's actually pretty bone-chilling. She's telling Luke, like, look, there's nothing you can do in this situation. I'm gonna get you. And then grandma just so happens to come out of the house to tell Luke it's dinner time, scaring the witch away. And shortly after this, grandma gifts 2 white mice to Luke for his birthday, a nice bit of foreshadowing, before she falls ill with diabetes. And decides to take Luke away on holiday to a hotel by the ocean. Once we're at the Headland Hotel, the movie really kicks into gear, with Luke and grandma arriving to the hotel on the same day that the witches are arriving for their convention. And I love the way that all of the other witches are fangirling so hard over the Grand High Witch immediately. Plus, I think it's really funny that their cover is being an anti-child abuse organization. So as Luke and grandma get settled into the hotel, we're introduced to Bruno Jenkins, Rowan Atkinson as the hotel owner, and his secret maid girlfriend, Marlene, who unfortunately discovers Luke's pet mice and has a full-blown breakdown over it. This little showdown between grandma and the hotel owner is also just really fun. She's great at playing him and getting him to allow the mice to stay under the condition that they stay in the room with Luke and her. I also really like the scene of Luke and grandma in the dining area, and grandma seeing the Grand High Witch for the first time and recognizing her but having no idea where from, and the Grand High Witch clocking her almost immediately and beginning to smile. It's never explicitly stated, but I like to believe that grandma once tracked down the Grand High Witch and they had some sort of fight, but the witch ended up wiping her memory. Later on that day, Luke sneaks his mice down to the conference room area to train them for his circus. And look, the witches' conference is the main scene of the movie. It's the scene people always show clips from when talking about this movie, and it sets up the rest of the movie flawlessly. This is also where I'd like to talk about the cinematography of this movie done by Harvey Harrison. I think for the most part, the cinematography in this movie makes it look like a British TV show more than an actual movie. But the one exception with the cinematography is the way that this conference room is shot with the red chairs and hardwood floors. It feels grand, but at the same time simplistic. So once the conference begins, the witches all begin filing into the conference room, and they're all eager to remove their shoes, gloves, and wigs because they're uncomfortable. And the face removal of the Grand High Witch is still legitimately terrifying, but not as terrifying as her final Grand Witch form. And just shout out one more time to Jim Henson's team for creating such a truly horrific character for this movie. And Huston's performance here is so over the top and wonderful. Like, she's not trying to be subtle at all. She's trying to act like the most evil woman that's ever existed, and she sells it so well. And there's just so much to love about this entire sequence, from the bald men in the crowd to this witch getting blown up to the entire explanation of the Grand High Witch's plan to use her magic potion to turn all of England's children into mice via chocolate bars. All of it is that fun kind of terrifying that really works as a kid, and as an adult you can recognize that it's terrifying, but the over-the-top nature and comedy were the things that really stood out to me on this rewatch. So their meeting culminates with Bruno Jenkins being brought before the Witches' Council as the Grand High Witch gave him some chocolate containing Formula 86 just before their meeting started. So he comes before the council and quickly and horrifyingly is transformed into a mouse. Again, the Jim Henson Company really cooked on these effects, and this is just horrifying stuff. Unfortunately for Luke, who's been watching all of this go down, just as the witches are about to leave, one of them begins to smell
Dog stopping.
and they start looking for the child and pretty quickly find Luke, who makes a break for it and does successfully get away, even saving a baby from being killed by the Grand High Witch. However, once Luke makes it back to his room to tell his grandma what he saw and what happened, he finds that she's been put into a deep sleep by the witches, who ambush him and force him to drink Formula 86, which of course turns him into a mouse. And Luke turning into a mouse is also absolutely terrifying, and this happens right around the halfway point of the movie. And I gotta say, the last half of this movie moves incredibly fast. First, Luke runs into Bruno, who doesn't even realize he's a mouse, and then the two have to sneak their way through the hotel to try and make it to Grandma so Luke can tell her what's going on. And the mouse puppets and animatronics are so impressive in this movie. The Henson team actually built 3 different sized mouse props for Luke and Bruno. The smallest were the size of actual mice, the middle size was about the size of a rat, and the biggest was a fully built hand puppet about 3 feet tall that was supposed to be used for close-ups. However, Rogue found that cutting from a close-up of a human face to a close-up of the mouse face just didn't quite look right, so the large puppets are only used in about 4 shots throughout the entire movie. Once Luke does make it to Grandma's room, he quickly explains what happened.
They turned me into a mouse.
And I love that she immediately understands, and while sad, she and Luke are both just grateful that he's alive. Now, while the witches are downstairs mingling and being punished by Bruno's rich, horny dad, Luke and Grandma make a plan to sneak into the Grand High Witch's room, steal the formula, and put it into the witch's food at dinner. So Grandma lowers Luke down because, of course, the Grand High Witch happens to be staying in the room directly beneath theirs. But unfortunately, the Grand High Witch has a mean cat that chases Luke around for a minute, but Grandma's able to distract him with her knitting. And right as the Grand High Witch enters the room, Luke finds the stash of Formula 86 bottles and snags one. Once Luke makes it back to Grandma, they decide it's time to get Bruno back to his parents. And the scene of Grandma trying to talk to Bruno's parents is sheer comedy. First of all, Zetterling's performance comes across as this crazy old woman almost immediately. Second, his parents don't believe her for a second and are, of course, extremely offended when the stranger tells them that their son has been turned into a mouse, and then she plops a mouse on the table. But it's Bill Patterson's performance as Bruno's father that really brings it all together. As the witches make their way downstairs for dinner, we get this fun moment of Mr. Bean's girlfriend going in to turn down the Grand High Witch's bed and actually using some of Formula 86 as perfume, which leads to one of the funniest visual gags in the movie, with Atkinson going to kiss her neck before seeing a patch of fur and just turning away. I also think that the setup of the Grand High Witch not letting her secretary eat dinner with them is incredibly well done. She sends her up to her room and we get this moment of her saying,
Didn't want to be one of them anyway.
which obviously sets up the ending of the movie. So as the witches sit down for dinner, Luke makes his way into the kitchen, and this is really a fun and tense little sequence of him trying to spike their soup with the formula and, you know, not be seen, caught, and or killed by any of the chefs in the kitchen, although poor Luke does get part of his tail cut off here. At the same time, Bruno's dad has decided he'd also like to try the delicious soup that all of the witches are eating. Luckily, Grandma is there to terrorize Bruno's parents just a bit more, dumping his soup on the table and finally forcing them to see and understand that Bruno has been turned into a mouse. We then get another truly horrifying sequence as all of the witches are transformed into mice. The Grand High Witch, of course, turning into the most disgusting looking mouse who gets trapped by Grandma and then slaughtered by Mr. Bean. And I know this is a kid's movie, but even if it weren't, I think the decision to show green goo instead of blood as the mice are getting stepped on and generally slaughtered was a great call, and it just makes the entire sequence feel that much more fun and insane. In the aftermath of everything, Luke and Grandma head home, and we jump ahead sometime later as the Grand High Witch's trunk is delivered to their door, thanks to Luke, and wouldn't you know it, it is completely filled with cash. Now, the ending of The Witches is one of the most controversial parts of the movie because it does not align with Dahl's original novel at all. Actually, Dahl was so angry about the change in ending that he wanted his name completely removed from the movie. That is, until Jim Henson sent him a thoughtful, apologetic, and complimentary letter that caused Dahl to calm down a bit and change his mind. And look, I know that Dahl's original ending with Luke remaining a mouse for the rest of his life is darker and probably a little stronger, but I kind of love that in this version of the story, the unassuming secretary turns out to be a white witch who decides to undo the damages she helped cause. And Luke turning back into a real boy is supposed to be this kind of like nice, uplifting moment, but it still comes across creepy and terrifying, but in a completely different way than the other transformations. Plus, I think it's really cute that the movie ends with Luke saying,
Don't forget Bruno!
It just shows that Luke really is a kind, sweet boy who didn't deserve any of the awful things that happened to him throughout the movie. So, 35 years later, what is the legacy of The Witches? Well, like most of Dahl's adaptations, it has developed quite a following since its release, but thanks to Anjelica Huston's performance and the Henson Company's effects, it's kind of an undeniable movie. I feel like the look of the Grand High Witch is one of the most accurate character adaptations found within any of Dahl's adaptations. And I don't think it's overstepping to say that Huston's performance and makeup are the primary part of this movie that keep people coming back to it over and over again. She's just so deliciously evil, and she loves being deliciously evil, and it all works together so well that even the parts of the movie that don't work as well don't really matter. And yes, there was another adaptation done in 2020 by Robert Zemeckis and starring Anne Hathaway, and that movie was so bad that I couldn't even get through the entire thing. I think I turned it off before even getting to the hotel. I honestly don't remember anymore. But let me know in the comments, what do you think of The Witches? Is it an all-time classic or just kind of an okay kid-friendly horror movie? Would you like to see someone else take another stab at adapting it? If you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. It truly means the world. And a special thank you to all of my members over on Patreon. You all make these videos possible. Patrons get early, ad-free access to videos, access to an exclusive Discord server, and they get to help me choose what movies to cover on the channel. If you'd like to join the Patreon, there's a link in the description below. And just a reminder that Born to Rant is a completely independent channel, and if you haven't yet, I'd love it if you could like and subscribe. We release new videos covering all of your childhood favorites every Thursday at 7 a.m. Pacific time. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.